Hi. Good evening. I'm Christina Tang, the Heritage Planner at the City of Windsor, and would like to welcome you to the Walkerville Heritage Conservation District Study Public Engagement Kickoff. We are delighted to be meeting with you about this exciting project. For this evening, we have planned for you a presentation for the first part of the evening. There will be 2 points when we'll take a pause and take any questions you may have. Then the second part of the meeting, we will be doing a 2-group brainstorming activities together. And then we'll wrap up the evening with some concluding remarks and next steps. So for the people on the virtual meeting link, you may use the Q&A function if you are on a computer, and we'll be ending the virtual meeting right before the group activities. For everyone else, we'll also be posting a recording of this meeting on our Let's Talk Windsor project webpage, which you can visit and share with anyone who couldn't join today, and also give input to our online survey. So just housekeeping wise, anyone who needs the washroom, they are available at the end of the hall, straight to your right at the end of the hall. And yeah, at this time, I'll introduce some of our core project team members we have present. And we would also like to acknowledge that we have Councillor Mark McKenzie here and Councillor Ed Sleeman, as well as some of our Heritage Committee members here, Kazan and Charles, as well as John Miller. So thank you all for coming. And from the city staff, we also have Michael Cook, if you want to give a wave, Tracy Tang, and Derek, as well as Nathan Lee at the sign-in. Very importantly, we are delighted to have our heritage consultants from MR Letourneau and Associates and Bray Heritage leading the project and facilitating tonight's session. Dr. Marcus Letourneau and Dr. Carl Bray both have experience working in Windsor as part of the previous team with the Walkerville Districting Plan. They have extensive experience developing and working with heritage conservation districts and studies across Ontario. Dr. Letourneau has on his portfolio also practiced a diverse variety of roles in the cultural heritage world, starting out as a former heritage planner himself at the City of Kingston, and was previously managing principal of a large heritage planning and archaeology consultancy in Ontario. He continues to do academic and teaching work at the University of Waterloo, Victoria, Algonquin College, and previously at Queen's Willowbank School of Restoration Arts, Carleton, and is serving on a municipal heritage committee and various boards, such as the International Council on Monuments and Sites Canada. Dr. Carl Bray similarly has a wealth of over 40 years of experience in private and public sectors and is a heritage planner, landscape architect, and urban designer. He is currently an adjunct associate professor at Queen's University School of Urban and Regional Planning, teaching heritage planning and community design. So with that introduction, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Letourneau to start us off with the presentations.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. And I want to start by echoing Christina by thanking all of you to come out, to listen, to participate, to ask questions. One of the things that we find really important to say right from the outset of this process is that a heritage conservation district is about community value. And it's about understanding what a community finds important, and it's understanding questions and concerns from the community. Next slide, please. We would like to start with an acknowledgement that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. The City of Windsor honors all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in their valuable past and present contributions to this land. Thank you. So today, in terms of the presentation, I'm going to talk to you for the first section of the presentation I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what is a heritage conservation district. What is the process? Where are we, most importantly, in the process? We're going to talk a little bit of the question about why Walkerville. And my colleague, Dr. Bray, will be talking a little bit about the history of Walkerville. This is not going to be a fully comprehensive history. This is sort of an introduction. And actually, one of the reasons we're here is to hear from you about what are the important aspects of Walkerville's past. As Christina mentioned, we will be doing some brainstorming activities, and you'll see already on your tables, we've given you some sticky notes, some markers, and a couple of maps, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. And we are going to finish the night with a bit of a thank you. We're going to outline the next steps. I think it's, again, important to really reiterate, this is our first meeting on what is actually quite a lengthy process. And even within the phase we're in, there will be plenty of opportunities for comment, for question. So if people go away from tonight and realize, wait, I thought of something, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask. Next slide, please. So next slide, we've covered that. One of the big things we also want to reiterate, it's really important that if there are questions, if there are concerns, don't hesitate to ask. What I often tell people is that if you have a question, there's probably 5 other people who have the same question. So do ask us, and don't be afraid if you think it's a silly question. There's no such thing as a silly question. Next slide, please. So to begin, what is a heritage conservation district and what is the process? Next slide. I'm going to start with what may seem like a very obvious statement, but it's really, really important. The Heritage Conservation District study process does not have a predetermined outcome. So we're not here today to say that you will necessarily have, at the end of this process, a heritage district. Part of this process is to answer the question of, should council proceed with the creation of a heritage conservation district? Does the area meet the test of provincial criteria for the creation of a heritage conservation district? So we have to, particularly in a very changed environment for legislation, we have to be able to demonstrate and defend the recommendations that we're making. Next slide, please. Now, if you're like me, I own a heritage property myself, and I remember when I first heard about heritage, the idea that comes to mind, you can't do anything with my house. I can't change my doorknob. I'm not going to be able to paint. Even Vikings are afraid of heritage conservation districts. It's a wonderful myth about heritage conservation districts and about heritage conservation in general. A well-designed heritage program will have no more requirements than fire code or building code. And indeed, it's not about stopping change. Heritage is a process about understanding what a community finds is valuable and putting in place policies and procedures that manage that value and protect those values through the process of change. We like to use the term a lot called change management. It's not about taste. And we hear this a lot of, well, you know, it's about these pretty old houses. Not necessarily. There is, and we'll talk a little bit about this, a prescribed provincial process. Indeed, for us, in the basis of how we create a heritage conservation district study, we actually have to follow provincial laws. It's also about hearing from a variety of voices. People who may say, we don't want a district. Tell us why. Tell us your concerns. Tell us what you see as some of the barriers to the process. But if you're supportive, again, tell us why. Tell us what is really unique about the community. And lastly, it's not just about the architecture. And Walkerville is a really unique case of this, where the natural environment, the parks and open space, the views, the vistas, the interrelationship between the places in the community are just as important. Next slide, please. So some of this language actually comes from the provincial government, but essentially a heritage conservation district basically seeks to identify what is the unique character of a community? What makes Walkerville Walkerville? What makes it different, from example, from Ford City or Ojibwa or, you know, some of the other communities in the neighborhood? What makes it different from downtown? So these are the questions that we need to try and get to the heart of. When you get to the planning guidelines phase, which is well down the road, and that's if council chooses to do that, you also will ensure that, okay, how does change respect what we're identifying at this point? Next slide, please. So what are the characteristics? When we talk about what is that character, and character is one of those funny words which we hear a lot. Well, the character is obvious. It's never obvious. We have to basically take time and learn how to describe what is the unique nature of your community. So we're looking at what are the concentrations of buildings, sites, structures, and landscapes. And one of the unique things that we've already found with our limited work within Walkerville is that you have different lotting patterns depending on where you are within the old village. So these are the sort of things that we are starting to look at. What is the relationship, for example, between the village and the water? How did the community form? And we talked about this actually with staff earlier today. One of the things we hear a lot in common is people are pretty firm, Walker Road is the boundary and the water is the boundary. But when we start asking where the other boundaries are, we get all different sorts of answers. Is there a sense of visual coherence? How do you know when you're walking around that something has changed? It was interesting today. My family's from Ford City, and I was driving down. I was showing Carl where my dad's house, my grandfather's house used to be. And I realized there's no trees on that. And it's like, that's one of the big things that I noticed the differences are the trees within Walkerville. Next slide, please. And I think it's important to recognize that heritage conservation districts aren't new. You actually have 2 heritage conservation districts already within Windsor, one of which is Sandwich. The first actually heritage conservation districts were created in 1980. So 43 years ago, actually, Carl was the author of one of the first ones. So you've got someone in the room who's seen the whole range. And as of 2020, there were 134 districts approved within Ontario. Now, going back to the question of, does this mean, what does regulation mean? Does this mean, you know, I can do this, I can't do that? I have to say, we've seen the spectrum across this province going from it just regulates the public realm to very restrictive. But what we've seen much more recently is the focus is on, it's not about those tight restrictions. It's about ensuring, for example, how does new infill fit within the community? And there are many studies ongoing within the province of Ontario right now. Next slide, please. So, as I said, the Ontario Heritage Act actually dictates what we have to do in terms of a study. We have to examine the character and appearance of the area, basically to try and delineate those limits, make recommendations on where those boundaries should be. So one of the activities we're going to get all of you to help us with is to think about where should the boundaries be? To consider and make recommendations on what should council decide? Should we recommend to council that they proceed with the district plan? We have as a team recommended against districts. And sometimes it's because an area doesn't have the character or the integrity. Sometimes it's questions of, is there political will? Sometimes are people using heritage conservation districts, for example, to try and stop a hospital? These are the things that we try and take into account when we make a recommendation. And lastly, looking at the policies and processes that currently exist and asking, are they working? What are their opportunities and what are those limitations? Now, one of the very recent changes is that the province has mandated that in a heritage conservation district, 25% of the properties must meet prescribed provincial criteria for designation. This is new. And what it requires is a far more detailed analysis of the buildings within a community than we typically would have done in the past. So some of you in the room may have remembered the 1997 effort at creating a heritage conservation district. That level of inventory, now we have to go beyond that, and we have to show that 25% of the properties actually meet. We're actually recommending more than that, because as a lawyer friend of mine said, if you do 25 and 2, I will bump out 5 properties and you no longer have a district. Next slide, please. So this very complicated flow document is the entirety of a heritage process. We are only talking in phase 1 about the first 3. So we're working on that phase 1, which would finish next summer, at beginning sort of May, June next year is when we would be bringing a report forward to council. So next slide, please. So all of those other things you can forget about. We're literally on that second bullet point, which is we've just started the study. And in our experience, it's very important to come to the community right at the outset to actually hear from you. Next slide, please. And we've worked on some amazing projects across the province. This is actually of a community in just south of Waterloo, where we wrote the district planning guidelines with the community. So the community said, what do we want to regulate? And it was one of the first districts that was created in that manner, where it was a community determination of what would be required, what would be optional, and what they'd like to see. Next slide, please. So some of you may have seen a couple of the city staff already wandering around the neighborhood, taking pictures. They're not spying on your houses, we swear. Looking at and actually starting to create this inventory. And beyond that sort of legal requirement that we have to have 25% with true criteria, it actually helps us in making that recommendation of should we proceed to the next step. How many buildings are there that retain their integrity? How many reflect the history of Walkerville? How many have been heavily changed? Are we seeing certain patterns, certain groupings? So for example, if you're on Monmouth, it's very, very different than if you're on Gladstone, and sort of asking some of those questions. It helps us at this stage to actually say, what is going to be important to protect? Next slide, please. So why Walkerville? It's a great question. And the more we've actually been working on the project, we've found some really fascinating things. I know Carl will be talking a little bit about this. Walkerville is often identified as sort of a garden suburb or a garden community. We've actually found it's a little more complicated and a lot more fun than that. So we'll talk about that bit of history. Next slide, please. Walkerville has been the focus of a number of different studies. And I know when we were working on the districting studies, one of the things we did here was like, there have been so many studies. And we're acknowledging, so you've had community improvement plans, you've had a previous effort at an HCD study. And one of the things for some of you who may have been involved in that study, part of what we want to hear is what worked from that process and what didn't work. You had a 2010 zoning bylaw amendment to prohibit front yard parking. And that's going to be a really important consideration going forward. We've seen streetscape improvements on a variety of streets. As mentioned, we were part of the districting plan, which is a distinct process from a heritage. It was much more focused upon urban realm, infill, and focused upon some of the commercial and industrial area. And there is an ongoing active transportation master plan for the area. And as some of you may have noted in the Windsor Star, there's a recent new proposal to create the VIA station as a hub between Chicago and Toronto. So that was something that we have noted that's brand new. And the question is what's that going to change? Next slide, please. I think the camera is out of focus, but one of the other things that we do here a lot is that aren't we already a heritage district? And we've heard that from a number of people. There's a thought that yes, you know, I thought we went through this process once before, and indeed, It went through a really detailed analysis for a much smaller area within the 1990s. It didn't go through for a variety of reasons that we've heard about. And council, coming out of the districting plan, realized and heard from the community that there was a desire to look at that option of creating a heritage district plan for the area. Next slide, please. See if I can. What Walkerville currently is in the official plan is what's called a heritage area. And that's sort of a green image that shows the heritage area as it is within the official plan. There are some heritage policies, but they're not as detailed and focused as you would find within a heritage conservation district plan. And as I said, you did have the theming and districting plan, which again was focused much more on infill, public realm, and down towards the creation of the distillery area. Next slide, please. So what are we doing as part of our scope of work? We are doing right now, we're working with staff and several community members who have come forward. We're looking at historical research. We're looking at the background to Walkerville. We are having discussions on the boundary. So in addition to meeting with yourselves, we're meeting with staff, we're meeting with members of council to get their perceptions on where that boundary should be. We'd like to talk with people about how they think the heritage of Walkerville should be recognized. And indeed, one of the things that we've come out of the HCD processes, in some areas, we say, well, you might have a heritage district there, you might have individual designation. You know what, you just need urban design guidelines in this area. So part of our work is to try and discern what is the best approach. Next slide, please. So this map, unfortunately, does not show up very well. One of the first questions we had was, when was Walkerville built? What are the ages of the homes within Walkerville? That orangey color dates to before 1924. So the vast majority of buildings within Walkerville are over 100 years old. So that actually, for us, when we were coming in, we were actually a little surprised by that. We were thinking some of them houses towards as you move towards downtown would have been more recent 1930s, 1940s. But we were actually quite surprised to see that when Walkerville was absorbed by the city of Kingston in 1935, most of the buildings that were here were already built. Next slide, please. I think we've lost a slide. Can we go back to? Okay, yes, this one. Thank you. This image is actually really important. The map, and this is the map you have on your desk. This shows the properties that are already identified by the City of Windsor as having heritage value, either as what's called a listed property, which means it's not designated but has been formally identified and recognized by council, or in the blue are the designated properties. Now, this distinction is really, really important because with the changes to provincial legislation, all listed properties will fall off the city's heritage register in January 1st, 2025. So all of those red properties will actually lose the limited protection they currently have as of 2025. So if we can advance 2 slides, please. One of the reasons, and we've had a lot of talk with city staff, is there's a concern that Walkerville has one of the largest concentration of heritage properties that have been recognized by the city, but this is one of the areas that would be most under threat with the change in the legislation. Next slide, please. Yes.
Our properties are listed but not registered. So does that mean that if we were to sell, or if our neighbor was to sell, that property could be subject to, it would not be subject to any kind of heritage protection? The new owner could do whatever they wanted with it?
Yes. As of 2025, currently as listed properties, generally the only protection is demolition control for a set period of time. But with this change, you wouldn't even have that. And the municipality would not be able to add it as a listed property again for 5 years. So, yeah.
Out of curiosity, why did the province pass this rule?
Some communities, let's be honest, misuse the legislation. They would take whole neighborhoods within large metropolitan areas, add them to heritage registers, and then say, okay, now we're going to negotiate for high rise. So it came out of experiences not in southwestern Ontario, and indeed I'd argue not in eastern Ontario. A lot of it is coming out of experiences and complaints about the GTA planning processes. But it's a good question because a lot of people are saying, how do the changes in Toronto affect other communities, and are they necessarily appropriate changes for other communities?
Well, obviously, when they made that change, they must have considered whether or not it was Toronto only or province-wide, because there are other rules that strictly apply to the GTA or the Golden Horseshoe, whatever you want to call it, you know, so why they went whole province-wide, they must have felt a reason. And I'm not thinking that your answer is sufficient enough.
It's a very good question. For those of you who might not have heard it on the live stream, the question is why has the province made the changes? There was a concern in some quarters that heritage was being misused, and it was being used not for heritage reasons, but for example, to control Planning Act applications. I can speak from experience, and I can say this for my own municipality. We actually wanted listed properties to remain. And we said if an owner wants to remain listed, because our municipality gave grants to listed property owners, they should be allowed to do so. And we were in Steve Clark's riding, and they wouldn't listen to us even within his riding. So this has been an issue, and I'm not going to stand up here and say that it wasn't misused. It was misused in some communities where people would say this is a great way to try and deal with Planning Act issues through the Heritage Act. And it's one of the reasons right from the very outset, we said Heritage Act has to focus upon the heritage value. And that's one of the reasons we're asking the questions of what's important, because if we're finding that the concerns are not heritage, this wouldn't be the tool we'd recommend.
Could it also be said that the changes were to help their developer friends, just like they did with the Greenbelt? That's the question.
Yes, the question was whether or not some of the changes were intended to benefit a certain community. That argument has been made. Other questions? Yes.
Multi-well units. Is that not something that is going to affect if we lose the designation on our properties where we can slow our house down in 25 and put a 6-unit building up on our lot, individual lot?
So right now, as of right, oh, sorry, the question, I'm sorry, I forget I'm on live stream. The question was whether or not the changes would mean that you could tear down something and put in something much larger, for example, a 6-unit. Right now, under provincial legislation, you can have, as of right, 3 units. No matter if you're a single family home. So if you want to add 2 units now, you're permitted as of right. What we've heard in a lot of communities is that they're not opposed and recognize that housing is a really serious issue. But the question is how do we add those secondary units? How do we do it in a way that both respects the character, but also recognizing that in many areas there is a need for additional housing? It's about, asking the question of what is the most appropriate way for new housing to be integrated within a community? Absolutely.
How does this study that you're going into, how's it going to fit in with the infilling study that was done for the interim control bylaw? That had a lot of recommendations about mature neighborhoods and so forth.
That's actually one of the studies that staff has identified that we need to take a look at and actually take to figure out how they work together. For those on live stream, the question was how does this study work with the infill study? I don't have an answer for you yet. We're actually in the process of just starting to look at some of those documents. Questions?
Chance to ask questions at the end.
Yes, as Carl mentioned, if you have questions come up, don't hesitate. We can answer them at the end. We're going to be circulating, so there's multiple opportunities for questions. Okay, at this point, I will hand it over to Carl, who will talk a little bit about the history.
Thanks, Mark. Well, you've heard a lot about what the study process is all about, what it can and cannot do. One of the reasons we're in this business is that it's actually a lot of fun, because we try to answer the question, how do you describe a community? So I like to use the analogy of how would you describe a person? So it's almost as though we're doing a biography of Walkerville. And so as in a biography, you need to know a little bit about the backstory. A little genealogy helps. So something about the way in which a community develops, both physically and as a social and economic unit. It's important in establishing what they are now, and more importantly for this process, how they can evolve into the future. And one of the exercises we've given in the past is to get people to summarize that biography on the back of a very small card, like a postcard, or in a tweet, where you're restricted in the amount of words or characters that you can use. And that's a useful focusing exercise in saying, okay, what are the essential characteristics that if we took any one of them away, it would no longer be that place. It would be someplace different. And it's quite a difficult exercise, but it's a very good one. And, you know, as you've heard, both of us have PhDs, and a lot of the research we've done is trying to understand how what's way down the brainstem that all of us take for granted. Well, it's obvious that Walkerville has character, but how do you define that character? Because in order to protect that character, you have to be able to define it so that you can put it down on paper, then translate it into planning speak that can then be form of legislation that you can actually use to control change, as Mark says. So that exercise of taking it from down here to up here is a large part of the Heritage Conservation District process. Next slide, please. So going back, most of the communities in Ontario have had occupation since the ice retreated 10,000 years ago. And the more we understand about Indigenous culture, the more archaeological evidence that comes forward, as well as oral history, gives us a better idea of how people have lived on the land for a very long time. What this map shows is there is evidence that there was a community in the vicinity of Walkerville, but probably not on Walkerville. But the extent to which that has been influenced in what you see now is, as far as we can tell, at least at this stage, fairly limited. But it's worth noting, not just for telling the story of Walkerville, but to showing respect for what's gone before, and for the idea that this has been a place where people have wanted to settle and have successfully settled for a very, very long time. Next slide, please. So this is just a close-up that shows the area in more detail. As Mark has described elsewhere, the community also seemed to involve the island and the river and inland areas. So it wasn't necessarily confined to a specific area. It influenced many of the areas around it. And ongoing archaeological investigation and the archaeological management plan that's underway will help fill in some of those blanks, as well as, of course, consultation with Indigenous people. Next, please. So when I say that much of the work that we do is fun, because it's detective work. And so what are the clues that we look for? And where do we find those clues? Well, some of them in our archives. What you see here is what's called a fire insurance plan. Insurers, being the people that they are, they want details on what will burn and what won't, and therefore whether they're going to insure something. So they're very, very detailed. And the first fire insurance plan started in the late 1800s. And so you can chart a community's progress right through the 1960s by referring to these plans. And they're usually updated about every 20 years. And they go right down to the building materials, obviously the location, and how many stories, all kinds of things that are very, very germane to understanding, get a snapshot of what that community looked like at a particular period in time. So what you see here is Walkerville at a very early stage, where really it was industries with some housing nearby. You can see a very rudimentary plot plan, a rudimentary plan of subdivision, as we would call it now, with little rows of frame houses, a railway track, and a bunch of industrial buildings. So really the germ of the later community. And you'll notice that most of it is quite close to the railway tracks and to the distillery complex, kind of up in the upper right-hand corner. So that's almost where the community core began. And then slowly it started to spread. Next slide, please. And there's still evidence of some of those early dwellings. Not many. These are a few of them that you can see here today. Many of the early ones were probably replaced. But as you can see, it was really housing for the workers. Very modest, nothing fancy, and put up probably fairly quickly. Next, please. But that changed. In 1890, Walkerville became incorporated as a village. One of the things to understand about Walkerville, there are very few comparables that we've been able to find. Some people have termed it a garden village or based on a garden city model. As Mark said, it's not quite. It's really a factory town with some beautiful bits, if you want to put it that way. Mr. Walker, the original founder, was very determined to have control over absolutely everything. Not that he had, web cameras in every bedroom, but it was almost that level. Anybody who lived here worked for Walker. He even created the fire department. He created the public works department. He built all the buildings, all of that kind of thing. But it got to a stage where he didn't necessarily want to run everything. So by incorporating as a village, then the village, the municipality, the little municipality, then became responsible for many of the things that formerly he would have had to deal with, such as public works and the police force, etc. But at the same time, and this is indicative of the kind of almost feudal arrangement that Walker had set up, he set up a development company that set about to lay out further expansions of the actual physical setting and to build more housing, some of it as tenancies for the workers, but also some of it for sale, either initially on a leasehold basis, but in some cases ultimately for freehold sale as individual properties. Again, most of the development was intended for people who had some connection to the distillery. So the models that one tends to think of are feudal villages in Europe and in Britain. To some extent, places like Pullman in the United States, but that kind of vertically integrated corporation was very much the kind of thing that Walker wanted to create, and so did his offspring in the next generations. Next, please. And you can see this in the documents. So the bylaws that were passed determined building materials. And in the bylaws detailing fireproof construction, they also talked about building materials. And in some of the documents, there were incentives for bringing a business to Walkerville that had a minimum of X number of employees, and you would get a tax benefit for that. You also were essentially told to build buildings of a certain size. So we are not aware, and it may still exist somewhere in an archive, some form of master plan for Walkerville. But from what we've been able to find, there were many bylaws passed that had quite an effect in determining what the place looked like and how it developed in various phases. Next, please. And you can see that in some of the documentation. So on the left, it's talking about some of these materials that are needed. And when I talk about a vertically integrated corporation, it's also interesting because Walker wasn't exclusive in terms of the industries and businesses he wanted in Walkerville. He encouraged others to come in. But what you tended to find, particularly as it affected buildings that his development corporation were dealing with, they were complementary. So when he's saying you needed to build in a certain way with certain materials, oh, by the way, those materials are made by a company that's just along Walker Road. And so it was a circular economy, if you will, that he had helped create. Next, please. And as you can see from this aerial view, yes, it all started with the industries. And so you had the railway, you had the ferry, you had the main distillery complex, but you also had the new industries that were attracted by that infrastructure and by that existing major industry, spreading up Walker Road, the creation of Ford City, and really the shift as the industry started to intensify, both in their footprint and in their diversity, the shift in the community going more inland, if you will, becoming more dominant as residential, and slowly the creation of a different commercial district along Wyandotte. So the community that you see today is really the second phase of Walkerville's evolution after its incorporation as a village. So if you will, it's teenage years and early adulthood. So full of vitality, lots of stuff happening, physically still growing, full of beans, and looking outward into the world for inspiration. Next, please. And there was a lot of inspiration. So Walker's son and his son's wife were very cultured. They're very aware of things happening in the world. They traveled widely, and many of their influences were from Britain in particular. And so it's highly likely that they were aware of the Garden City movement in Britain in the early 20th century. So they might have even seen some of them. We're hoping to find some evidence that was the case. But whether or not they picked up anything more than the aesthetics, the look of those places, is debatable. But the look certainly was something that influenced them. So the boulevards, the heavy emphasis on lots of tree planting, on setting very high standards for architecture. So one of the things that really stunned us when we looked at Walkerville was the sheer number of properties that had been architect designed. And it's a remarkable list. So that level of design control on private property, as influenced by the development corporation that Walker set up, was mirrored by the design control and quality in the public realm, in the streets, in the boulevard, in the tree planting, all of those sorts of things. And then things like the axial view down to the church and the creation of a church that was very reminiscent of something you would find in an English village. So there was a bit of nostalgia, there was a bit of copying, there was certainly a flavor of a garden suburb, but it was very much an industrial community. Next, please. And it had just about all the things of a complete community. It had transit, it had parks, it had a whole commercial strip, it had public facilities, all those sorts of things, but also reminiscent of a village in Britain. It had a manor house. We're in it. It had the parish church, St. Anne's, and it had the source of prosperity, farmland around, much of it owned by Walker, as well as the main industrial complex. And increasingly, and that pattern that's manifests throughout Britain, for example, in North America, as a community develops and the more upscale neighborhoods go upwind from the factory. So the West End develops And that's the same thing that happened in Walkerville, away from the industry, away from the railway, and upwind. So that helps explain how the community shifted towards the downtown and further south towards what was still then the farmland that Walker owned. Next, please. And so as it evolved, this is kind of a view that you would see in the early 20th century. The industrial areas are filling out, but off to the right of this image is where most of the residential and institutional buildings were starting to fill in. And you can already see, even in this first decade of the 20th century, how many trees are already mature. Next slide, please. And you can see it perhaps more in this slide as the industry is concentrated up in the kind of the top corner, and increasingly inland, you're seeing row after row of residential properties. Long blocks with interior lanes, and that's characteristic throughout Walkerville. And that gives you lots of opportunities for infill development along those laneways. And so some of the questions that you've been asking about, well, how do you accommodate those 3 units as of right? You've got opportunities in the back, and we can get into that a little later in our discussion. Next, please. And again, industrialized waterfront, but Walker was a philanthropist in some ways, but he also wanted to have a happy workforce. So you had a bowling green down by the headquarters. You had very high quality public spaces. You had the commemorative fountain. You had a marvelous train station. You had a number of things that you would find in a mature community at a very early stage in Walkerville. And that was all intentional. Next, please. And you got a commercial district almost immediately. And so you had kind of at right angles, if you will, to the residential, you had this link to the downtown and a link across to Ford City. And you had very high quality buildings there, including a mix of commercial and residential. You also even had a music hall. So again, elements that you would find in a city were compressed down and miniaturized here in Walkerville. Next, please. So if you wanted to use the analogy of a person, Walkerville had a midlife crisis when during the Depression, it could no longer sustain itself as an independent municipality, and it was incorporated within the City of Windsor, despite fierce opposition from the people who lived here. But already by that stage, the influence of Walker had waned. He, of course, died. His sons had a bad habit of dying almost at the same time, just around the time of the First World War. And there wasn't really a succession plan. So the development company continued on for a while, but really what you're seeing is Walkerville up to the time that it became amalgamated with the City of Windsor, because most of it, as Mark showed in an earlier slide, had been built by then. And really that's the remit that we've got, is to look at Walkerville up to 1935 as the most important defining framework within which we work. Next, please. And life did continue, of course, afterwards. This is an image from the visit of royalty just after amalgamation in 1939. And as you can see, there were lots of people there. There was a strong sense of the railway station and that kind of intersection between the industry and the residential, institutional, and commercial areas. That was where people gathered around the commemorative fountain, down by the train station, down in there. So if you were thinking of a town square, it was almost in that area and then over to Wyandotte. So that again is something you would find happening much more slowly in a bigger place. It happened very quickly and reached a mature state in Walkerville by the time of amalgamation. Next, please. So fast forward to the mid-1950s, not a lot had changed. The industry had shrunk a little bit, was still a going concern, and there were new developments like the grain silos along the waterfront. The the railways were in decline and the railway station was demolished not long afterwards. Some of the larger properties were demolished for low-scale apartment buildings. But that said, that's a small percentage of what was there at the time of amalgamation in the mid-1930s. So very little substantive change. The trees grew bigger. The houses may have had minor upgrades, but save for that, the introduction of the automobile, the change in buying patterns, all those things showed relatively little impact on Walkerville. Next, please. And essentially, here we are. So as the industry changed and really consolidated, you had redundant buildings, some of which were demolished, but as in this case, they were rehabilitated for more contemporary uses. You had the advantage of very substantial, well-designed industrial buildings that are very, very adaptable. And as you see in many, many communities around the world, these are very good investments. They're expensive, certainly, to rehabilitate, but they pay their way back as very desirable places to work and to set up businesses. Next, please. And one of the things that is often asked about in a process like this, I say it's biographical, your storytelling. And one of the outgrowths of storytelling is marketing. So if you want people to come to a portion of Walkerville, I'm not saying you want to flood the residential areas with a lot of visitors. None of us want that. But for example, if as part of the districting plan, you're talking about developing a distillery district in that area of where the existing industries are and where some of the blank spaces have been left by departed buildings, how would that be marketed and what would be there? So we do an exercise of identifying what the major themes are. So what are the key points in Walkerville's life, biography? And we've suggested some here. And then how does that translate into physical form? And we've made some suggestions about what those physical forms might be. And as I mentioned previously, it is those physical translations that find their way into a Heritage Conservation District plan policies and guidelines. Next, please. And that's where we are. So thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take questions about my portion, and then you can breathe and shake your legs, and we'll move on to the breakout sessions where you get to put your thoughts down and discuss with your neighbors. So any questions for me right at this stage? Yes.
Mentioned open and noise, but never mentioned use of term utopian town. That is there a reason why you shy away from that?
Well, you've asked some interesting people. Marcus's doctoral thesis was on utopian communities. Many of my master's and doctoral case studies were towns, for example, that the Quaker philanthropist in Britain did, like Port Sunlight, places like that. I looked at other utopian communities in North America, and the difference between utopian communities and places, and even like the garden cities, they had a utopian aspect in that they were essentially based on socialist principles. So land would be held collectively. They would be managed collectively. So they're in some ways the antithesis of a factory town, which is really under the control of one entity, the corporation. And believe me, I know what I'm talking about. My dad was a geologist. We went where the ore was, and I grew up in mining towns where you didn't own anything. You were a tenant. The company built everything, but the company was everything. So Walkerville is a funny hybrid of those two, in that it evolved out of the feudal master and into much more of a democratically run place, but it wasn't designed that way. It just happened to be designed in a way that was adaptable to a more democratic setting. The question being, had we looked at utopian settlements as precedents above and beyond the kind of factory towns or industrial towns like Pullman in the United States? Other questions? Yes. Good question, and I don't know the answer. Just, the answer was the strip, along Walker Road next to St. Luke's. St. Luke's, did Walker's ownership extend that far? I don't believe it did. I'm going to turn this over to someone who might know.
I know from, actually, my grandfather worked for it. I know that Walker brought in Ford to create the factories. I'd have to go back and see if he owned the land or just encouraged him to purchase the land adjacent. Walker Road, as you know, was a bit of that hard edge. But I'd have to go back and see because he bought several of the old French farms that were on the waterfront, which were, as you know, thin but long. And that would be one of the questions I'd have to go back. I know when you went back to the farm itself, it was down towards where the airport was. So you had the farms further down. I'd have to go back and check, but I'm not 100% sure, but I think he may have. I know he told Ford to come and purchase some like this.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay, if there are no further questions for me, I encourage you to stand up, stretch a little bit, and then we'll commence with the second part, the breakout exercises. So just take a quick break, please, and then we'll get into that very shortly. Thank you very much. I know. But if I